You are about to take an audiovisual tour of the battlefields of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. The narrative on this cassette is closely related to the scenes on the slides. You should be watching the first slide, a view of Germanna Ford. Periodically, you will hear this tone. The next time and every time thereafter that you hear the tone, advance to the next slide. Dr. J. Luvaas will conduct your tour. Dr. Luvaas is an eminent historian and an enthusiastic tramper of battlefields. Even if you have visited the Wilderness in Spotsylvania, you will not have seen many of the scenes that Dr. Luvaas will show you. Dr. Luvaas is about to begin his tour. Remember, do not advance to the next slide until you hear the tone.
On numerous occasions, in 1862, 1863, and the first part of 1864, the Rapidan River marked the boundary between the Union Army of the Potomac and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. 3 times Union troops crossed the Rapidan River here at Germanna Ford. The first on April 29th, 1863, when 2 Union Corps, the 11th and the 12th, crossed en route to Chancellorsville. 2 brigades waded across the stream. The others crossed on the wooden bridge rebuilt atop the old piers, which had been destroyed earlier in the war. And about 50 Confederate cavalrymen on the opposite bank were captured while on picket duty. On November 26, 1863, Warren's 5th Corps crossed here on its way to turn Lee's line at Mine Run. It took this corps 6 hours to cross. This time they had a pontoon bridge. And again on May 4th, 1864, Warren's Corps, along with the 6th Corps and Burnside's 9th Corps, crossed here on pontoon bridges on their way to the Wilderness. The objective in 1864 was Lee's army. And General Grant, Commander-in-Chief of all Union armies, had directed General Meade, still the commander of the Army of the Potomac, Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. Grant was trying to get his army through the Wilderness before he was forced to battle with Lee. Lee, still occupying his old lines farther up the Rapidan at Mine Run and in his winter camps between Orange and Gordonsville, Virginia, was determined to force battle in the Wilderness. The Confederates had at this time about 65,000 men available for service. The Union forces had roughly 115,000 men. The terrain in the Wilderness would favor Lee. Grant's problem was not getting his infantry across this river or through the Wilderness. They could have gone all the way through the Wilderness the same day that they crossed the Rapidan. But he was wholly dependent upon his wagons for supplies. He could not use the railroad, nor could he use water communications here. He was dependent upon a train of 4,000 wagons, which, on a single road, would consume about 70 miles. And it took these wagons 30 hours to cross the Rapidan River further downstream. He had to keep his troops in the Wilderness to protect these wagon trains until they were safely across. This gave Lee time to storm out of his fortifications and meet Grant head-on in this area known as the Wilderness. The Lacey House, the only remaining structure that was there at the time of the battle, dominates the fields and open ground just east of the Wilderness. Here the 5th and a portion of the 6th Corps encamped on the night of May 4th. Located near the junction of the Germanna Ford Road, which Grant's army used to march to the battlefield, and the Orange Turnpike, which was one of 2 roads used by Lee's army to reach the area, the Lacey House was a scene of much activity during the 2-day battle. The headquarters of General Grant, Commander-in-Chief of all Union armies, and of General Meade, Commander of the Army of the Potomac, were in the fields nearby, as were the hospitals of the 5th and 6th Corps. On the first day of the battle, these 2 hospitals alone received, fed, dressed, and sheltered over 2,300 men. Together, all Union hospitals on the battlefield looked after 10,000 wounded, most of whom were evacuated to bases further north the day after the battle. From the Lacey farm, the Wilderness remains essentially unchanged, except for a National Park Service road that meanders behind the Confederate battle lines and 2 housing developments hidden between the Union and Confederate lines. A staff officer on Meade's headquarters described the Wilderness has mostly a low, continuous, thick growth of small saplings, 15 to 30 feet high, and seldom larger than one's arm. The half-grown leaves added to the natural obscurity, and there were many places where a line of troops could with difficulty be seen at 50 yards. This was the terrain on which we were called to maneuver a great army, a land of an exhausted, sandy soil, supporting a more or less dense growth of pine or oak, with some cleared places. Only a few narrow woods roads crossed the wilderness, and as Colonel Lyman wrote home, "If you consider that the men must often move by fours, then a division of 4,000 men, closed up, would occupy in marching some 1,000 yards, and by adding a space for pack horses and the usual gaps and intervals, it would be nearer a mile. So you see how an army would string out even with no artillery. You must also remember that these long columns cannot move over 2 miles an hour, often not so much." The initial fighting on May 5th took place between Ewell's Confederate Corps and Warren's 5th Union Corps along the Orange Turnpike. Toward evening, 2 divisions from the Union 6th Corps marched along the very woods roads that you see here on the left to prolong Warren's battle line to the right. The fighting on May 6th occurred several hundred yards through the woods in front, but the Confederate flank attack late in the afternoon of the 6th caused the Union troops to the right of this sector to fall back about a mile and throw up a new line of trenches. These particular trenches that you see here were built that night by the Confederates to incorporate the first Union lines and to consolidate their position against a possible counterattack. The Battle of the Wilderness was not the first battle where trenches and breastworks were used to minimize casualties, but these Union works, in front of Ewell's position astride the Orange Turnpike, represent an important step in the evolution of field fortifications. Previously, the trenches generally consisted of a single line running along the forward crest of whatever high ground was available. But these works, which had been thrown up in haste on the 5th and were improved under fire throughout May 6th, are more complex than the single line. Traverses or earthen parapets running at right angles to the front were found necessary to shelter the men from enfilade fire. What we actually see here is the beginnings of a trench system, as opposed to a conventional breastwork. These particular trenches were evacuated after Gordon's flank attack on May 6th successfully rolled up a significant portion of the Union right flank. The troops fell back a mile and threw up a new but less formidable line. On May 6th, the Confederates, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, launched flank attacks against both ends of the Union lines. On the Confederate right flank, 4 Confederate brigades from Longstreet's corps, which was just arriving to support the hard-pressed troops of A.P. Hill's corps, which had been fighting in the woods on both sides of the Orange Plank Road since noon on the previous day, utilized this unfinished railroad cut to march unobserved behind the left of Hancock's 2nd Corps, then on the verge of breaking through the thin Confederate lines. Like an army of ghosts rising out of the earth, these Confederates stormed out of the cut to take the Union forces in flank and rear. Hancock's men stampeded and fell back to their trenches along the Brock Road, and Confederate General Longstreet, at the head of his advancing troops, was seriously wounded by fire from his own men as they attacked from the railroad cut in the direction of the Plank Road, where the main Confederate force was now advancing. Outflanked, Hancock's troops fell back to the works they had constructed upon their arrival at noon on the previous day along both sides of the Brock Road. This unimposing crossroads was the key to the Union position during the 2 days of fighting in the wilderness. The road running from left to right is the Orange Plank Road, running from Orange to Chancellorsville. It intersects here with the Brock Road, the main north-south road. If one were to turn left on the Brock Road, he would eventually reach Germanna Ford, and he would pass along the way the areas where the bulk of the Union Army was concentrated during the 5th and 6th of May. If he were to turn sharp right, the road would take him to Todd's Tavern and ultimately to Spotsylvania, a strategic crossroads of even greater importance. On the 5th, and until outflanked on the afternoon of the 6th, Hancock's corps made repeated assaults against the weary men of A.P. Hill's Confederate command, about 1 mile down the Plank Road to your left. As Hancock wrote in his after-action report, the country was covered by a dense forest, almost impenetrable by troops in line of battle, where maneuvering was an operation of extreme difficulty and uncertainty. The undergrowth was so heavy that it was scarcely possible to see more than 100 paces in any direction. No movements of the enemy could be observed until the lines were almost in collision. Only the roar of musketry disclosed the position of the combatants. It was a blind and bloody hunt to the death. When Hancock's men fell back to their breastworks at the crossroads, they were subject to furious attacks by Longstreet's men, late in the afternoon of May 6th. As Hancock says in his report, the breastworks on this portion of my line were constructed entirely of logs, and at the critical moment of the enemy's advance were massive flames which it was impossible at that time to subdue, the fire extending for many hundred paces to the right and left. The intense heat and the smoke, which was driven by the wind directly into the faces of the men, prevented them on portions of line from firing over the parapet, and at some points compelled them to abandon the line. Despite these adverse conditions, Hancock's line held. The trenches do not look formidable now. They're but slight wrinkles on the earth. That was because these breastworks were made of logs, and these logs were set afire by the exploding shells and burned. All that is left is the residue of these logs. But the breastworks were about 5 or 6 feet high at the time of the battle. Had this crossroads fallen to the Confederates, Grant would have been forced either to retreat back across the Rapidan or else to fall back in the direction of Fredericksburg, which would have dealt his hopes for the campaign a serious blow. No fighting took place on May 7th, as both armies strengthened their defenses, reorganized their scattered commands, tended the wounded, and prepared for the race to the next strategic road junction, Spotsylvania. The next major battle, at Spotsylvania Courthouse, was also fought over possession of a strategic crossroad. At Spotsylvania, this old tavern sits astride the Brock Road as it continues southward, and a main road to Fredericksburg, to the northeast. As long as the Confederates could hold this crossroads, Grant would have to reroute his army further to the east. But since his objective was to destroy Lee's army, he decided to fight it out on this line if it should take all summer. Late in the afternoon of May 7th, Grant's wagon trains lumbered off. At 9 that evening, the 5th Corps left its trenches astride the Orange Turnpike and marched south on the Brock Road, passing behind Hancock's corps as it held its line of smoldering breastworks. Sedgwick's 6th Corps marched by the Turnpike and the plank roads to Chancellorsville, and then turned south on the Piney Branch Road to rejoin Warren's Corps a couple of miles north of Spotsylvania. Hancock's 2nd Corps followed Warren on the Brock Road as far as Todd's Tavern, where it entrenched and protected the line of march from any attempt of the Confederates to move against it from the west along the Catharpin Road. Burnside's corps followed Sedgwick to Chancellorsville, but later it swung east to approach Spotsylvania along the road from Fredericksburg from the northeast. Lee had originally intended to move from the Wilderness early on the morning of the 8th, but burning trees and brush prompted Anderson, who had taken over command of Longstreet's corps after Longstreet was shot by his own men along the plank road, to begin his march several hours earlier than ordered. Thanks to the delaying tactics of General Fitzhugh Lee's Confederate cavalry, which dismounted and contested every favorable rise of ground as the 5th Corps moved slowly along the Brock Road, Anderson reached Spotsylvania first. When Union cavalry could not dislodge Lee's dismounted troopers here at Laurel Hill, a Union infantry division was deployed and attacked up these grassy slopes. But in place of dismounted cavalry, it ran up against Kershaw's infantry entrenched in the far woods. A 2nd Union division came up, then a 3rd. Together they mounted a second assault on May 8th. This brought some of the Union infantry to within 50 yards of the Confederate line, but it failed as well. Again on May 10th, and also on the 12th, divisions from the command of Warren, Sedgwick, and Hancock charged here, but they were never able to penetrate the woods in front of the Confederate lines, which was filled with a low growth of dead cedar trees whose hard, sharp-pointed branches made it difficult for the troops to advance under heavy musketry and artillery fire. The Confederate line here was situated where it nearly always was possible to bring some flanking fire against attacking troops. As you drive along the park roads and along the Brock Road toward Spotsylvania, it's very easy to overlook this hill. One has to get out of the car and walk some distance to see it. It was a formidable obstacle to the men of the 5th Corps, who on 3 separate days tried to capture the Confederate lines concealed in the woods ahead. Blocked at Laurel Hill, about 1.5 miles north of Spotsylvania, Grant next attempted to turn the Confederate left at the Po River about 1 mile to the southwest. Here, Hancock's 2nd Corps encountered Confederates from Mahone's division, which had been shifted from Lee's right to his left at the last minute. strongly posted in trenches overlooking the Po River. No assault was actually attempted here. The Confederate position simply was too strong, and Hancock later was pulled back to join the right of the 5th Corps in the assaults on Laurel Hill on May 10th, and ultimately to play the leading role in the assault at the Muleshoe on May 12th. Meanwhile, the Union 6th Corps had moved into position to the left of the 5th Corps. By noon on May 9th, Burnside, advancing down the Fredericksburg Road with 2 divisions, had crossed the Nye River and established a fortified bridgehead around the Beverly House, less than a mile from Spotsylvania. I wish I could assure you that this was the original house. Certainly this structure was on the site of the original house, and it is easy to identify the extreme left of the Union line. It's on the high ground just overlooking the Nye River. From here, Burnside dug his way slowly to several forward positions as he inched his way to the area where the rest of the Union Army was making its assaults against the main portion of the Confederate line. Originally, Lee held a line stretching about 2.5 miles, with his left flank anchored on the Po River and his right flank on the River Nye. But when Burnside crossed the Nye 1.5 miles to his rear, he quickly pulled back the right of his line to form the famous Muleshoe, a salient which would enable him to block the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps in the vicinity of the Brock Road and still keep Burnside at arm's length from the important junction at Spotsylvania. With Lee's army solidly entrenched between these 2 wings of the Union Army, Grant's first concern was to reunite his forces. And to do this, it was necessary to pinch off the salient known as a Muleshoe, and later remembered, for good reason, as the Bloody Angle. Until May 12th, no Union troops were in the area which you see in the background. Hancock's assault on May 12th against the Bloody Angle came out of those woods, which were then open fields. The first attempt to crack the Confederate line was a brilliant charge led by Emory Upton. His after-action report is rather graphic. The point of attack, which was shown to me by a captain of the engineers, was at an angle of the enemy's works near the Scott House, about 1/2 mile to the left of the Spotsylvania Road. His entrenchments were of a formidable character, with a battee that would befall in trees with the points sharpened and faced in the direction of the attack. It served as a primitive barbed wire, with a battee in front and surmounted by heavy logs, underneath which were loopholes for musketry. In the reentrant angle to the right of the house was a battery with traverses between the guns. There were also traverses at intervals along the entire work. About 100 yards to the rear was another line of works, partly completed and occupied by a second line of battle. The position was in an open field about 200 yards from a pine wood. A wood road led from our position directly to the point of attack. This is the very wood road to which he refers. And he led in 4 lines. He deployed 12 regiments. They broke through the 1st Confederate line, could not penetrate the 2nd. A Union division was ordered to support them, but that division never appeared, and 12 regiments simply were not enough to maintain themselves in the middle of an enemy position, and Upton was forced to fall back. Upton is one of the most unusual soldiers of the American Civil War. He gained distinction in earlier battles as an artillery officer. Here he commanded an infantry brigade. He later went on to become a distinguished commander of a cavalry division. And in the post-war years, he wrote the first combined infantry, artillery, and cavalry manuals for the United States Army. This is the site of a simple white wooden house known as the McCool House. It lies several hundred yards behind the Confederate line, right in the middle of the Bloody Angle. It was important because to the Union soldiers massing to attack this position on the 12th, 2 days after Upton's partially successful attack, the exact location of the Confederate front line was unknown. They could not get close enough to reconnoiter. Confederate skirmishers kept them at arm's length. They did know, however, that the line was somewhere between them and this house. And since the approach march started about midnight, and they had to move the men over a good distance in formation, keeping quiet, they took a compass bearing on this house, and they knew that if they followed that bearing, sooner or later they would encounter the Confederates dug in. To the attacker, the terrain at the Bloody Angle was more formidable than it would appear to the person driving along the park roads. We are looking toward the Confederate position marked by the two monuments in the distance. And we're looking from a ridge on which the Landrum House stood. On the 12th of May, during the fight for the Bloody Angle, Union forces poured over this ridge, down into the ravine in front, and up the slope to the Confederate lines. The division of Hancock's Corps that passed over this point was in an assault formation 20 ranks deep. And in the area that you can see here, both the 2nd and the 6th Corps fought continuously for about 18 hours, trying to wrestle possession of the Mule Shoe from the Confederates. Because they attacked at 4 in the morning on the dark and very foggy day, and because they did not bother to stop and fire at Confederate pickets, but simply rolled over them, there's 20,000 men massed for an attack, they were able to achieve a surprise. It was the most successful frontal attack carried out in the Civil War. It was only after the Confederates mounted a series of counterattacks that the fighting became so fierce and so bloody. If you visited the battlefield before the summer of 1978, you probably never noticed this particular section of trench. This is the original Confederate trench at the point of the Bloody Angle. It is on the forward slope facing to our left. It has been obscured by a heavy growth of trees for many years. The trenches that the visitor sees along the Park Road were the Union trenches, which were erected after this battle on the 12th, which incorporated the original Confederate position. In the fighting for the Bloody Angle, well over 50,000 men fought each other savagely for possession of Ewell's Confederate works. It's difficult for words to convey what they must have experienced. The memories of one 6th Corps veteran are of bloodshed surpassing all former experience, a desperation in the struggle never before witnessed, of mad rushes and of his sudden repulses, of guns raised in the air with the butts up and fired over log walls. In Confederate General Gordon's words, the bullets seemed to fly in sheets. Scarcely an exaggeration when it is remembered that bullets alone chewed apart an oak tree 22 inches in diameter. Even night did not end the fighting. It only served to increase the awful terror of the scene. Sometime after midnight, Lee's troops, staggering and wild-eyed, fell back to a new line that had been frantically thrown up across the base of the salient. When Union skirmishers poked their way cautiously forward the next day, they found the Confederate dead and wounded piled 4 deep in these traverses. Their own bodies were lying mostly in the open, quote, many nothing but a lump of meat or clot of gore where countless bullets had torn them. Altogether, between 10,000 and 12,000 soldiers fell in what was indeed a bloody angle. The survivors, inured to all of war's horrors, found new horrors here. The attack of the 12th was supported by a number of artillery batteries. And after the Battle of the 12th, these dug in. The entire ridge on which the Landrum House sits, several hundred yards from the Bloody Angle, contains a large number of these gun pits. And they fired very effectively into the Confederate positions during the fight for the Bloody Angle. Before May 12th, this was a Confederate trench. After the fight for the Bloody Angle, it was modified and incorporated into the new Union line. And Union forces operated it for the rest of the battle. But the Battle of Spotsylvania lasted from May 8th until May 21st. And while the fighting rarely was as heavy as it was here in the Bloody Angle, there was fighting practically every day throughout the battle. There was no serious fighting on the 13th, but that night the 5th and 6th Corps sloshed through the persistent rain and mud with the intention of turning Lee's right flank. But they were too late and too exhausted to mount a general assault, and the action on May 14th was limited to a seesaw struggle for possession of Gales Hill, which dominated the left flank of the new Union lines. On May 15th, Hancock moved all of his divisions, except one, to the Fredericksburg Road. That night, Anderson's corps completed its march from Lee's left at Laurel Hill to the extreme Confederate right, which rested on the Po River. Both armies spent the next day working on their entrenchments, and on the 17th, the 5th Corps threw up an advance line to enable Grant to shift his weight once again to the right. Well, both sides fought desperately for something like 20 hours for possession of the Bloody Angle. Other Confederate troops threw up a new line cutting across the base of the salient. Once this line was finished, the Confederates in the Bloody Angle fell back and occupied it. And for the next week, this line was strengthened and improved daily. It is the most formidable line of field earthworks in Virginia. As one walks along it today, you see not only the initial trench and breastwork, there are dugouts. Some of these dugouts were really log bunkers, because one can see where the entrances were once the logs collapsed and the dirt fell to the bottom. The entrance can still be seen. There are what we would call foxholes, or what the Civil War soldier referred to as rifle pits. There are traverses, these lines running at right angles to the front. There are separate gun positions contained within the line of trenches. And at many places there is a second system of trenches 100 or so yards behind the first. And these trenches were covered in front by a blanket of fallen trees, a battee, 75 to 100 yards thick. They were never really assaulted, although on May 18th, General Grant, who had meanwhile tried to work his way around Lee's right flank, always to be met by Lee, who could shuttle his forces across the position much quicker than the Union forces could march along the outside. On May 18th, Grant ordered an all-out assault against this position from the Union lines, now at the Bloody Angle. At 4 a.m. on May 18th, the 2nd, 6th, and 9th Corps attempted once again to carry Lee's line at the base of the old salient. There would be, however, no repetition of the 12th. No Union soldier ever reached these entrenchments. And at 10 a.m., Meade ordered the attacks discontinued. The Union medical reports for this day are revealing. Among the 1,100 wounded, most were hit in the hands and arms, quote, and in many of them the skin being so blackened with powder as to prove that the injury was self-inflicted. Manifestly, Grant's men had had enough of seemingly useless assaults against earthworks. This Confederate cemetery reminds us of the human cost of these battles. The losses in the Wilderness are difficult to determine. Grant reported casualties in excess of 17,000. Lee probably lost about 9,000. At Spotsylvania, Grant lost another 17,000. Lee perhaps as many as 10,000. From here, the armies maneuvered south in the direction of Richmond. There were trenches as formidable as the trenches at Spotsylvania, at the North Anna, fearful fighting at the Totopotomoy and Cold Harbor. Ultimately, of course, Grant's army, reinforced by troops in the vicinity of Richmond, reached and crossed the James River, laid siege to Petersburg, and pinched off the railroad lines that nourished Richmond and Petersburg. But it was a long campaign, and Grant suffered a total of about 60,000 casualties in all of these battles, which are just simply lumped together, known as the Wilderness Campaign. The fighting here was quite different in character from fighting earlier in the war. It was never glamorous, and as one encounter and blended into another, or an approaching corps went astray in the murky forests, the battles displayed an amorphous quality that caused many a veteran in the ranks, and probably most students of the Civil War as well, to yearn for the exciting days of a second Bull Run